I will be your host here tonight for the next hour. And especially as there are so many first-comers here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by giving an intro into what the GMAT is essentially, which is to say how you should prepare for it. And especially as the GMAT is such a different test from what you've seen in college and or in high school, this is a very important part of the webinar. Before I would just like to say thank you to all of those who have come. There is a 25% discount on all of our GMAT courses for the next 48 hours. You can use this coupon code, go on our website, and you will be able to use this if you want. So this is what many students look and feel like when they are studying for the GMAT, just banging their head up against the wall of equations. And actually, though, this isn't a very accurate image. So it's not an accurate image because this is not how you should go about studying for the GMAT. And let me try to explain what I mean about that. So the problem with the GMAT in general, the reason that most students struggle with it is one, and especially why I as a teacher struggle in teaching the GMAT, is that there are many different ways to solve every single question. So we're going to go into a bit more detail about what this means later on, but especially some of you said that you wanted to learn techniques to solve questions quickly. So going through the internet, going through different courses, you'll find many different techniques. And for the same question, you'll also find many different techniques. And so when studying, one of the big problems that students have is what should they learn? Which techniques should they learn? And this can be very frustrating. Problem number 2 with the GMAT is that your biggest enemy in these exams is time. So if you had 5 to 10 minutes to solve each and every one of the GMAT questions, doesn't matter if this is quant or verbal question, you would definitely be able to do it. You'd probably be able to feel a bit lazy and relaxed while doing it, but you don't. You have approximately 2 minutes per question on average for every single one of the question, both in quant and in verbal. And this puts you under a lot of time pressure, a lot of stress, and it can make it solving things very hard. And it can also make focusing in on the details very hard. And one of the reasons that people make mistakes on questions is that they just make silly errors. You make calculation errors, you miss a plus, you miss a minus, you don't notice that it says integer, you don't notice that it says only positive or only negative, so on and so forth. This makes the GMAT very frustrating, and it can create a wall, especially for those of you who mentioned the difference between 600 to 700 level questions and 700 level questions. Then this is usually it. It is the level of detail in the question. All right, so this is something else that you need to focus on. And together, what these mean is that all of the one-size-fits-all courses, they're just not very well adapted to teaching for these types of exams. And this is why we have developed examPAL, and this is also how we recommend that you study for the GMAT, which is to say, we don't recommend that you just take a course that goes through everything and sort of go through it, waltz through it, and hope that the course teaches you everything. No, you have to focus in during the course on what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And at examPAL, we've done most of the heavy lifting for you. So we use AI, we use crowd wisdom, we have sort of statistics on all of our students and so on and so forth. And we've already looked at which methods are most effective and which are fastest. But even if you don't work with us, this is something that you need to work on. This is something that you need to build up in order to succeed in the exam. And together, this is called cognitive flexibility. What is cognitive flexibility? Cognitive flexibility is essentially the number of tools that you have in your GMAT solving toolbox. So when you look at a question, how quickly can you decide what the fastest way to solve that question is? When you look at a question, how many different ways can you think of to solve that question? And these two together, sort of the number of tools that you have in your question solving toolbox and the speed with which you can choose which tool to use for a given question, this is what will determine your success or failure on the GMAT, along with, of course, your focus, sort of how many small mistakes you make. But this is the number one thing that you need to develop. Okay, and just to sort of show what I mean by this, I would like all of you to take a moment to try solving the question on the board. So this question is, I'll just read it out. For every positive x and y, 3x plus 2y divided by x plus y is between 0 and 1, 1 to 1.5, 1.5 to 2, 2 to 3, or 3 to 4. Now, I'd like all of you to solve it, and I would like you to type the answer in chat. But more importantly than just typing the answer in chat, what I would like you to do is type how you got to that answer. So what technique you think you should use in order to solve this specific question. All right, and we're going to tie that together with cognitive flexibility. So have at it. Type the answer, what you think the correct answer is, into chat, and also type in what technique you think should be used to solve this question, how you went about solving the specific question. All right. We have everyone so far saying that they've plugged in numbers, though they got different answers. Oh, and I see E is corrected to D. Anyone else? Has anyone else solved this question in a different way? The answer is D, of course. This isn't a terribly difficult question. It's somewhere around the mid-level, I suppose. Maybe mid minus. No idea. Great. Okay, that's great. So we're going to see a few different ways to solve this now. Anyone else? Any other suggestions for techniques to solve this question? And what I want to emphasize with everyone writing stuff in chat is also that you look at each other's answers. And usually we have quite a few different suggestions for solutions in chat from students. And what this emphasizes is that every single person has their own unique style and has their own unique thing that they are good at or bad at. And in here, for example, is a completely different type of solution. And I think with that, I'm going to go and show 3 separate solutions to this question, all right? Each of the solutions that I'm going to show is going to be fundamentally different in approach. So it's going to utilize different types of thinking, okay? So solution approach number 1 is, let's call it the high school method. We call these the precise approaches. This basically just goes and sort of plugs in, or rather chugs through the equation via simplification or via whatever other calculation oriented method. In this specific case, we can take 3x plus 2y divided by x plus y. We can rewrite the numerator as x plus 2x plus 2y divided by x plus y. Then we can separate this out into x divided by x plus y plus 2x plus 2y divided by x plus y. That is a fraction plus 2. And therefore, our answer is between 2 and 3. Now, you might be looking at this specific solution and going, I would never have thought to do this. I would just stare at the equation all day long, or rather the expression all day long. I would not see this. This is not something that I think of, and that's great. That's fine. That means you should not solve questions this way, but it also means that when you're studying, you should learn how to look for different solutions for questions like this. So sometimes you will have to do precise type calculations, and in those cases, you'll want to have an alternative set of tools which can enable you to solve this question without calculating. And the most common alternative tool, which is one that quite a few people suggested in chat, is just pick numbers. And in this specific case, we can pick x equals y equals 1. Usually when picking numbers, we want to pick the numbers that make our life as easy as possible. And so if we pick x equals y equals 1, then the expression we have is 3 plus 2 divided by 1 plus 1, which is 2.5. Therefore, we eliminate options A, B, C, and E. And the correct answer is choice D. Now, note that when we do an alternative method, then 1, there is a student who made a mistake in calculation and picked E. But 2, we don't really understand why this is the correct answer. So if I were to change, say, the expression into 6x plus 2y divided by x plus y, then the person who did the precise explanation could pretty much right away tell me what the change in answer would be. But a person using an alternative approach who just picked numbers and plugged them in would not. So alternative methods in general are methods that get you to the right answer. So using this, you know that the right answer is D, but you don't always know why it's D. You don't understand the logic behind it. And a third type of approach to answer this question, which is different from the other two, is sort of the bird's eye view approach. We call these the logical approaches. And these approaches rely on underlying logical principles of the concepts, and are usually sort of more wordy and logical and less calculation intensive, and they're certainly not guessing. So in this case, the logical approach would be to say, okay, I mean, this is a fraction. All of our answers are sort of like integers. So really we need to know how many times we can multiply the denominator to get to the numerator. So for example, if we say 2 times the denominator, which is 2 times x plus y, then we're less than the numerator. Therefore, the fraction is larger than 2. But if we multiply the denominator by 3, which is to say we say 3 times x plus y, then we're more than the numerator. Okay, and therefore we are between 2 and 3. So this is sort of kind of like a stream of consciousness, thinking out loud, logical type approach, fundamentally different from the other two approaches. And if we look at all 3 approaches together, then what we have on top is what we call the precise type approach. This is a very calculation oriented. You just put in the equations, you do the math, and you're done. There's no thinking, or not too much thinking involved. There's the alternative approach, which is sort of, I don't really know what to do with this question, but I do know how to eliminate a bunch of irrelevant answers, and so I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to go with whatever's left. And then there's a logical approach, which involves sort of zooming out and trying to understand fundamental principles in the question. Together, this is PAL, precise alternative logical. This is what we call the palgorithm. This is sort of what we have developed our program at examPAL in. And as I mentioned before, sort of we've tried really, really hard to do all of the heavy lifting for you. But even if you don't choose to go with us, then sort of this cognitive flexibility, this toolbox of different approaches, is something that you need to develop. All right. And we started off with a guy banging his head up against the wall, and that's usually because studying all these math and grammar rules isn't necessarily the most fun thing you've ever done in life. So we do try to make our specific lessons interactive with teaser videos, interactive questions, and so on. Ways you can do this by yourself is by studying in a group, making flashcards, using mnemonics, using all sorts of tricks to just keep yourself engaged, which is really important. After that, you do need to focus in on improvement. So this is another very, very important slide. This is at the heart, part of the heart of our specific GMAT teaching program is how do you improve? So people talking earlier about the 600 versus 700 level CR questions. So the main thing to do in improvement, and this ties into everything I've been saying so far, is that you need to know yourself. So even if you solve a question correctly, then you need to figure out what the tool that you use to solve that question correctly is. And on our website, we focus you in on this because we directly ask you after every question what you did. And more importantly, if you get a question wrong, you need to figure out why you got it wrong. What was the reason that you got it wrong? What were the other wrong answers? What sort of traps do the wrong answers have? This sort of self-study, this self-research is what will take you from sort of, let's say, the 650 level to the 700 plus level. And in general, it will get you past that glass ceiling. So what many students find is that they study. At some point, you learn the material, you know the material. And once you reach that point, you stop improving. And you stop improving because you keep doing the same things over and over again. And this phase, this improvement phase, is focused on getting you past that. All right. Then the optimization phase, like again, on our website, we try to do most of the heavy lifting for you. So we suggest which solutions are best for you based on your past performance. There's a bunch of statistics on our website, and we've gotten a bunch of awards. Excellent ratings that you can check out. And most importantly, there is a success guarantee. So this doesn't sound like it's relevant to most of you because you're first timers, but for any of you who are retakers, or if unfortunately you will need to retake the exam, then we do offer a success guarantee for improvement. So check that out. Okay, so all of that was sort of the intro to the webinar, in which especially for all of you first timers, I try to explain how to approach the GMAT in general. So how you should go about studying for the GMAT. And now we're going to get into the meat of the webinar, which is keys, things that will help you excel at data sufficiency and critical reasoning questions. So part one is going to be about data sufficiency. And what makes data sufficiency hard? And I guess, you know what, let's take a minute or two, and I'm going to ask this question, sort of, what do you guys think? What makes data sufficiency questions hard, in your opinion? Type in the chat, please. And once again, look at all of your colleagues' answers, because this is always interesting to see what other people who are in the same situation as you think. Don't get irritated by the statements. Definitely don't get irritated by them. So most of the answers we're seeing so far are variants of convoluted, confusing, understanding the questions. There are a few people who say the math, but mostly it seems to be centered around confusing and convoluted. I 100% agree with you. And sort of the first thing that, in my opinion, it makes data sufficiency hard is the confusing format. So this is a very, very different format from standard questions where you just have a question, then you have 5 answer choices, and you need to pick which of the answer choices is correct. Data sufficiency questions look something like this. All right. So first up, you have the question on top. Then you have 2 statements. So for example, the question could be, is x plus y equal 5? I don't know. That's like a really, really simple question. And then statement number 1 could be x equals 2, and statement number 2 could be y equals 3. And then your 5 answer choices aren't actual answers to the question, but they're trying to understand, whether you have enough information to answer the question if you would really want to. So answer choice A basically says that statement 1 alone is sufficient to answer the question. That means that whatever the information in statement 1, it's enough for you to answer the question. Answer choice B says that statement 2 is alone. Answer choice C says that statements 1 and 2 together are sufficient, but alone they are not. Answer choice D says that each one of them alone is sufficient. And answer choice E means that you don't have enough information to answer the question, even if you put both of the statements together. All right. All of this is a bunch of words, and this is something that you just need to sit and like look at for 5 to 10 minutes until you get it. You need to do it once. You need to memorize these answer choices, and then you never look at them again. Specifically, we recommend like this helpful, let's call it mnemonic. So answer choice A is you need only A, B is only B, C is you need to combine them, D is you need to divide them, and E is that it is impossible to answer the question. All right, so this is the #1 reason that people find data sufficiency questions confusing, especially at the start. #2 reason is that there's a ton of small details in these questions. And some of you mentioned getting the question right and so on and so forth. And this ties into it. And so I put like just a few examples of things that can really change the answer to data sufficiency questions. And one of these is, for example, is the question talking about only about integers, or maybe it's also about fractions? Are we looking only at positive or also at negative numbers? If we reach a specific conclusion, so for example, if we plug in numbers to a statement and see what happens, is this conclusion always true? Or is it true only some of the times? And all of these sort of small things really require you to put a large amount of focus into data sufficiency. And because cognitive resources are scarce in the exam, you're usually tired mentally, then this makes it hard. All right, something else which is hard in data sufficiency is that it basically tests a more abstract and understanding of concepts usually. So if you're looking at a standard problem solving 5 answer choice question, then you need to look at the question, you need to translate it into equations properly, then you need to go through the equations, and then you're done. And if you don't know how to do this, then you can use the answers to help you along. So you can look at the answers and try to use the answers to help guess how to solve the question. In data sufficiency, this doesn't really work. You need to look at the question. You need to understand what concept the question is asking about, and then you somehow need to guess which tool to use, what to look for. All right, these 3 things together make data sufficiency very, very difficult. And we're going to drill down into 6 specific tips on how to solve data sufficiency questions. So tip #1, key #1, is that you need to know what to look for. And let me show what I mean by that. So let's look at a data sufficiency question. If AB equals 64, is A larger than 8? Now, the natural tendency for most people, and this will repeat itself in critical reasoning later on, is to look at the statements and to try to think about the statements and think, are these statements sufficient or not? What I would like to suggest is a different approach. And you might think it's not necessary for a simple question like this, but it is definitely necessary for more complicated styles of questions. And the different approach is to first look at the question stem, to analyze it, and to ask yourself, what sort of information would I need in order to answer this question? And specifically, because we're asking about a range, then let's look at the edge of the range. So if A equals 8, then we know that B has to equal 64 divided by 8, which is also 8. But we need to figure out if A is larger than 8. So for A to be larger than 8, then B has to be smaller than 8. And additionally, for A to be larger than 8, which means positive, then B also has to be positive. Now, what we've done here is we've actually solved the question before we've looked at the statements. So just by analyzing the question stem, we've gone over all of the logic behind it. We've understood that the correct statement has to tell us that B is smaller than 8 and B is positive. And so knowing this, we can then look at the statements and see that this is exactly what 1 tells us, but it is not what 2 tells us. And therefore, the correct answer to this question is A. All right, and sort of to summarize key #1, what we've gone over in this specific question, first, you need to figure out what information you need. Ideally, like in a perfect world, this isn't always possible, but you would like to be able to look at a data sufficiency question, look at the question stem, and say, in order to say, if this is to answer this question, I would need such and such information. Then you look at your statements and you ask yourself, does the statement give me the information or not? If it does, it's sufficient. If it does not, it is not sufficient, and you're done. And this prevents much of the confusion that people mentioned before. All right, let's look at the second tip. So the second tip, and this has to do with focus, and honestly, this gets much, much better later along, but especially at the start, students sometimes have a tendency to forget that they need to analyze each statement independently. All right, so let's take an example. So if x is an integer, is x plus 1 divided by x an integer? And we're not going to try to logically analyze this specific question because it's not very clear how to do so. Instead, we're going to look at our statements. And okay, so I just want to comment to the person who asked why b is not an answer, and let's go over this. This is extremely important. So b squared is smaller than 64, but you don't know if b is positive or negative. B is less than 8, but b could also be -5. It could be -4. It could be -3. And this is precisely why we did the analysis beforehand. So you know that b is positive, and this focuses you in on what to look for. And again, I urge all of you to look at what your colleagues are saying in chat, because many students make these types of mistakes. So this is something to watch out for. And this is why pre-analyzing the question can help you avoid these types of things, because you know what not to miss. Okay, back to this question. So looking at statement number 1, we're going to go with the alternative approach in this case, which is to say we're just going to try numbers and see if we can find different values for x or not, and see which values of x we can get. For example, if 2 divided by x is an integer, then maybe x could be 1, x could be 2, x could be -2. We don't actually know. And therefore, we don't know if x plus 1 divided by x is an integer or not. So for example, if x equals 1, then x plus 1 divided by x is 2 divided by 1, which is 2. But if x equals 2, then 2 plus 1 divided by 2 is not an integer. And so the answer could be either yes or no. And so statement number 1 is insufficient. So we can cross off A and we can cross off D. Now, we'll move on to statement number 2, and here's where we need to be careful, because many students, and again, especially to start, have a tendency to forget that they need to analyze the statements independently. So they'll sort of look at statement number 2 and they'll say, oh, x is a positive even integer, sort of based on statement number 1, then that means that x has to be equal to 2. And therefore the answer is no, so B is sufficient. And in this case, they usually mark either B or C. And this is a mistake. This is a mistake because they've used the information in statement number 1 in order to also address statement number 2. And this is not what you are supposed to do. And this is something to be extremely careful about. Again, this is something relevant more for first timers than people who are familiar with the questions. So how do we solve this question? We look at statement 2 by itself. So if x is a positive even integer, then x plus 1 is a positive odd integer. Therefore, x plus 1 divided by x is odd divided by even. This is definitely not an integer. And therefore, the answer to the question is no. And here's another thing that we need to be careful about. Okay, and the fact that the answer is no means that we have sufficient information in order to answer the question. The question isn't asking us, is the answer yes? The question is asking us, do we have enough information to answer the question? Because we can answer the question with a no, then B is sufficient. All right, if this isn't 100% clear to you, then go over this question again later on. But this is an extremely important point about data sufficiency to understand. And let me just summarize these 2 points. So the second key, the second take-home message that we talked about is more for first-timers, but it is that when analyzing the information in one statement, make sure that you're ignoring the information in the other. You're not accidentally sort of letting one go into the second. And the second take-home message is that if you see a definitive answer in yes/no questions, this is either yes or no, then the statement is sufficient. So you don't need to get a yes, you need to get a definitive answer. Cool. Question number 4. So see the full picture. The whole can be more than some of its parts. And what I mean by this I'll show with this specific question. All right. So this question is as follows. In rhombus QRST above, what is the length of QS? Which is not drawn. All right, and we're going to go for a precise approach in this question, which means we're basically going to follow the rules and sort of give it like, let's call it a textbook answer. All right, so the textbook answer to this question goes with writing first this specific equation. So there's 2 ways to calculate the area of a rhombus. One is the product of diagonals divided by 2. The other is the side times the height. If we plug in sort of the letters for the sides into this, then we have QS times RT divided by 2 equals QT times PR. And this is one equation with 4 variables in which we need to figure out what the length of QS is. So in order to calculate QS, we need to figure out what the length of the other 3 variables are, which are RT, QT, and PR. Okay, and so looking at our statements, we can say, well, I mean, 1 only gives us the value of PR, but that's not enough because we have another 2 variables that we don't know, which is QT and RT. So we can cross off A and D. And then similarly, 2 only gives us the value of QT, which is not enough. And so therefore we can cross out B. And then the sort of the natural thing to conclude for this, or to continue from this, is to say that, well, I mean, both of the statements combined, they give us QT and PR, but we're still missing RT. So we can't calculate. And so therefore the answer is E. And in this specific case, it's a mistake, and especially in geometry questions, but also in other types of questions. When you're combining material, you need to make sure that there isn't something else given in the question that sort of adds on additional information. And this is what I meant before when I said that the sum of the parts is sometimes greater than the whole. So in this specific question, if we just write down our data, and we look at the figure a little bit, then we realize that if PR equals 9 and in QT equals 15, then because we're talking about a rhombus, and this is sort of the additional data that is hidden in the question, because it's a rhombus, then QT equals QR. That means that QR is also 15. So now what do we have? We have a right angled triangle. QRP is a right angled triangle. So we can figure out the length of QP using Pythagorean theorem. And notice that we're not actually going to do this. We don't care what the actual answer is. In data sufficiency questions, you don't want to find out the answer. You just want to know if you have enough information to calculate the answer should you want to. So we can calculate QP. That means that we can subtract it from 15 to calculate PT. And that means that we have another right angle triangle that we can use to calculate the length of RT. And again, we won't actually do any of the math. We just need to know that we could do it if we wanted to. And therefore, combining the statements also gives us implicitly the value of RT. And that means that C is the correct answer, because combining the statements is enough in order to answer this question. Now, this isn't an easy question, all right? This is a hard question. It's a geometry. It involves a bunch of stuff. But the take-home message from this is extremely important. And it is that make sure that both of the statements do not add additional added value beyond what sort of just each statement gives on its own. So this is like, take an extra 5 to 10 seconds to think about it, to look at it, to make sure that you're not missing something else. Cool. Fifth key. Yes, you will get a recording for the session. Sometimes I have a tendency to speak a little bit quickly. I apologize if I do. The session is recorded. It will be emailed to everyone. I do urge you to stay and just to look at the questions and to think about them, ask questions in chat. If I'm going too quickly through something and you don't understand it, then please let me know and I will try to slow down or change things a little bit. Okay, fifth key. Simply simplify the unsimple. What does this mean? This is especially oriented towards word problems. And this is not only for data sufficiency, this is also for just problem solving in general. And when looking at word problems, what I found is that many students just get confused. They read the entire word problem, they try to hold all of the logic of it in their mind, they lose some details along the way, and they end up getting the wrong answer. And so the suggestion for this type of thing is to simplify. And simplify, the goal of simplification in general is to make your life easier. It's to help you understand. It's to help you be able to make a logical inference from the data. So let's take a look at this specific question. All right. So reading through it, $15,000 was invested for 1 year in 2 different funds. A third of the amount in Fund A, which earned K% simple annual interest. And right there, we can pause. We can just write down that little bit of information on our sketchpad, and we can write $5,000 in A at K% interest, right? A third of 15,000 is 5,000. We have K% interest. We just write that down like a bullet point. And then we can continue on, and we can say that, okay, the next piece of information in this text is that the rest is in Fund B. So that means that $10,000 are in Fund B, which earned M% simple annual interest. What was the total interest earned that year? So what we need to calculate is the total interest. This is 5,000 times like what we have in A times the interest in A, which is 5,000 times K divided by 100, plus 10,000 times M divided by 100. This is the interest from B, which is 50K plus 100M. All right. And so what we've done is we've taken this complicated word problem and we've translated it into simple equations, and so little bit-sized equations that we can look at and we can think about. And it's much easier to sort of understand what you're doing when you're looking at these small little bite-sized equations than when you're looking at a long word problem. This is why we simplify, so that we can look at things and we can understand. And so from here on, it's relatively standard with a little twist. All right. So we can look at statement number 1. All right. So maybe take a step back. So we said that the total interest is 50K plus 100M. To answer the question, we need to know the value of K and the value of M. So we look at statement number 1. What does 1 tell us? 1 tells us that Fund A earned 1.5 times the interest percentage of Fund B plus 1%. Translated into an equation, that means that is K equals 1.5 M plus 1. This is one equation with 2 variables. It doesn't give us exact values for K and M. Therefore, we cannot calculate 50K plus 100M. Therefore, this is insufficient. All right, so 1 is insufficient. We can cross off A and D. For exactly the same reason, statement number 2 is one equation with 2 variables. We can't use it to calculate K and M. Therefore, it is insufficient. And combining them together, it looks very tempting to say, yes, it is enough, because we have 2 equations with 2 variables, and therefore we should be able to solve it. And the trick in this specific question is that we don't actually have 2 equations with 2 variables, because the equation we're given in 1 is exactly half of the equation we're given in 2. So if you take K equals 1.5M plus 1 and you multiply it by 2, you get exactly what's written in statement number 2, which is 2K equals 3M plus 2. So essentially, both of the statements are giving us exactly the same information. And therefore, we do not have enough information to solve the question. And the answer is E. All right. And the take-home message from this specific question, rather the two, is first of all to simplify. So if you're looking at a long, confusing question, if you feel that you don't understand what the question is asking you, this is relevant for especially for verbal, but also for long word problems in quant. Then take your long word problem, take the thing that's confusing it, and break it down. Break it down into small bite-sized equations, and then you can look at these, and it's much easier to think about them. Literally write them down on your scratchpad and look at them. It's amazing how strong of an effect this has. And the sixth sort of take home is that when both of the statements give you the same information, then they both have the same answer. So if statement number one was sufficient, statement number two gives you the same information as statement number one, then statement number two is also sufficient. In the above question, statement number one was insufficient. Statement number two gave the exact same information as statement number one, and therefore statement number two was also insufficient. So summarizing all of these together, these are the 6 most important things that you need to do when focusing in on data sufficiency questions. Number 1 is the ideal case, when you sort of know what the question is asking, you know the concepts, you know what to look for. You just analyze the question stem. You sort of infer what sort of information you would need in order to answer the question. And then you look for that in your statements. You ask, does statement 1 give me this information? Does statement 2 give me this information? If yes, sufficient. If not, insufficient. Number 2, again, this is mostly for first timers, but it can also affect people who are pro at this, but are just tired and worn out because they've been doing GMAT for an hour or so, is to remember to analyze each statement independently, and don't let sort of information from one statement leak over into the other. Number 3, and this is also sort of a trick in data sufficiency questions. If you have a definitive answer, whether that answer is yes or no, then it is sufficient. All you need to do is figure out if you have enough information to answer the question. I'll just note here that the other type of data sufficiency question is the value question. So what is the value of X? Like, for example, in this question, then we needed to figure out the total interest earned that year. So we need to figure out a specific value. So this isn't a yes or no question, but you need a specific number. So then if you have enough information to figure out this exact number, it's sufficient. If you don't, then it's not sufficient. To the person who says they're having problems on their screen, then I suspect it's because of internet issues on your side. So far you're the only one who's complaining about this, then check out the recording and watch the recording later, and it should be much, much smoother for you. Okay, data sufficiency key number 4 is to see the big picture. So be careful that if you use a certain logic for 1 and a similar logic for 2, then that putting the 2 pieces together, putting statement 1 and statement 2 together, does not add additional information into the picture. This is another sort of very sneaky data sufficiency trick that you should know about. Number 5 is to simplify. And again, the goal of simplification is so that you understand. You're not just playing around with equations. You're trying to transform all of the numbers or words or whatever it is into information that you have a much easier time thinking about and inferring from. This is why we simplify. Number 6 is if you have the same information in the 2 statements, then they both give the same answer. If both are sufficient, then the answer is D. If both are insufficient, then the answer is E. Perfect. That ends the data sufficiency part of the webinar. Let's take a few minutes to see if anyone has any specific questions about it before we move on to the critical reasoning part of the webinar. So, questions so far, comments so far? To get a Q48 or less, how many 700 level questions do we need to solve in the real GMAT? It's very, very hard to answer this question. In general, these types, so for Q48, I'm not sure if you have to solve any, to be honest. But in general, you shouldn't focus on solving the 700 level questions. It's much, much more important to make sure you get the easy and medium questions right. Oh, we really do have first timers. So the quant section is scored on up to 51. 51 is the maximum score on quant. It's also the maximum score on verbal. And then your quant and your verbal scores are mixed together into a total score, which ranges from 200 to 800. Check out our blogs if you want more information on it. I won't explain more now. To answer the original question, it's more important that you get the easy questions right. It's more important that you get the medium questions right. It's more important that you answer all of the questions. I wouldn't worry about how many 700 level questions you need to answer correctly. Cool. Okay, so it looks like we don't have any more burning questions for this part. So we're going to continue on to the next part, which is critical reasoning. So 4 really, really important tips to answer critical reasoning. And similar to before, we're going to start off by what makes critical reasoning hard. And again, this microphone goes over to you. What, in your opinion, makes critical reasoning questions hard? For those familiar with the format, of course. Too many options are tempting. To the person saying statement, could you elaborate a little bit what you mean by statement? Inference, logical inference is hard. Finding the conclusion and assumption, I assume you mean in boldface questions. Assumption and conclusion. Eliminating trap answers, eliminating contenders. Quite a few of your responses here in chat have to do essentially with tempting options and eliminating options and so on and so forth. I 100% agree with you, and we're going to address this in a minute. Choosing between 2 options is confusing. Okay, so we have quite a few answers. Let's go over into what I have prepared in advance. So number 1 is the time pressure. As all of you know, and as we've mentioned before, you have in verbal you have about 150, 1 minute 50 seconds on average per question, but this is unevenly split. So sentence correction takes less, reading comprehension takes more. Critical reasoning should usually be around the 2-minute mark on average per question if you're doing it properly. Some people say up to 2.5. But the problem is that you're under intense pressure and you have to think. So quite a few of you have mentioned assumptions, conclusions, things looking similar, confusing. This is hard because there's a lot of subtle things going on in critical reasoning, and you have to analyze and understand every single one of them. All right. Number 2 is that the text itself is confusing. So the GMAT loves to give us convoluted sentences that run on for 3 lines, where you have the subject at the end and the verb at the beginning. You're familiar with this from sentence correction, I assume, but it's also very true in critical reasoning. Right, and these 2 things together, mainly it's about confusion and how to be fast and not confused in critical reasoning, come together to you do not have time and you do not want to go over all of the answers. So my number 1 answer to all of you who said that eliminating contenders, many answers look similar, and so on and so forth, my number 1 answer for you guys is probably that there's a decent chance that you're going about critical reasoning wrong. There's a much, much better technique to go over critical reasoning in general, and that's what we're going to go over today. And so again, we split things into precise, alternative, and logical. These are the 3 types of methodologies that we teach. In critical reasoning, this translates the precise approach into just using the given data, which is to say you look at the question, you read the information in the question. Based on this, you infer a likely solution directly based on whatever is written in the question. And then you look at your answer choices and you see which of the answer choices is likely. And then you select an answer choice, and then you don't have to think about each and every one of the answer choices. And again, we're going to see sort of an example of this in a bit. The logical approach in critical reasoning involves with things that have some sort of equation in the background. So for example, the logic of profit versus revenue, the logic of supply and demand. Sometimes you see questions that have to do statistics. Is the average higher? Is the average lower? What is the range of values? All these types of things, they're based on like a fundamental equation behind the scenes. These use sort of quantitative type logic. And again, it's a similar idea. So you read the question, you think using what you know about profit, revenue, cost, so on and so forth, you try to infer a likely answer, and then you look at the answer choices and you see which of the answer choices fit. Last, and this is the least preferable method for critical reasoning, is to go over every single one of the answers, to think about every single one of the answers, and to try to understand which of the answers is the best fit. One of the reasons that this is a bad way to go is because sort of a good analogy for the 5 answer choices in critical reasoning is that these are 5 expert salespeople. Each one of them is very, very good at selling his own specific idea, and you need to figure out which one of them is telling the truth and which 4 are lying. It takes a bunch of brain power. It's not terribly fun to do. It's not recommended. And the second reason is that it just takes time. It just takes a ton of time to read and to think about every single one of the answers. So again, the alternative approach should be avoided. Sometimes there's no choice, and we'll see an example of this later on. Okay, so the first key to critical reasoning questions, as you might have guessed, is breaking it down, is taking the passage, breaking it down into its logical components, and trying to infer a likely answer. All right, and in fact, I so want to emphasize that you do not look at the answer choices that I'm not even going to show you what the right answer choices, what the possible answer choices for this question are. We're just going to go over the question and we're going to try to figure out what an answer choice would probably look like. And then we're going to look at the answer choices and we're going to see if such an answer choice exists. Okay, and in this case, it's going to be a logical approach. So we're going to go over and we're going to break down the logic of the question. Many new office buildings have emerged in St. Martin, virtually doubling the available office space. We can sort of summarize this as there are new office buildings, there's virtually double the office space. We can continue on. The city is expected to maintain its population, does not currently have any shortage of office space. Okay, this is just more facts. There's no logic so far. So there's the same population, there's enough office space, and notice that in my logical breakdown, I'm just trying to write down really the relevant evidence for the logic. Everything that's irrelevant, like the name of the place and all sorts of additional descriptors, we're just going to leave them out. We don't care about them. They don't affect the logic. The last sentence is where the logic really starts to play. Nevertheless, investors have almost tripled the amount they were willing to pay for any available office space or any future office building projects in the city. But even though there's double the office space, because of new buildings, even though there's enough office space for everybody now, investors paid triple the money. And this is sort of surprising. And when you see something which talks about investing and later on what would justify the investor's willingness to pay, then it's very likely that there's going to be something in here about revenue and cost, maybe something in here about supply and demand and so on and so forth. So in this case, if we sort of take a step back and we just look at our statements and we think about it, then what we're saying is that the investors paid more money. Therefore, they expect a higher return, even though there's a very, very high supply. And sort of the next slide is the suggested answer to this question. So what do you think? Go ahead and type in the chat. Based on sort of the logical breakdown of the question, based on sort of the lead-in that's written on, what explanation could possibly justify the investor's willingness to pay more money? Just give it a guess. Just based on what you have here in front of you, what could possibly justify this logic? All right, so we have high revenues, good location, expecting rise in working population. So this is an increase in demand. Investors will be conducive in forcing people from other states to come here. So more people come here, meaning more demand. You guys are converging basically on the likely answer, which is that there's more demand. If people are paying more money, even though there's a high supply, then there's going to be a reason for it. They're expecting to make money from this. All right. So our answer is going to have to do with they're expecting to make some kind of money from this. So either there's a very, very high demand for it, or the prices are going to go up. You don't know exactly what the solution is going to be, but you know the general area of where it's going to be, and you know what parts of like logical, what parts of the passage it needs to connect together. All right. So once we have our likely answer in mind, we can look at all of the answers, and I'm just going to tell you straight away that it's C, because C is the only one that does this. And when you're going over the answers, you shouldn't actually read and think about them. What you should do once you have a likely answer in mind is you should skim through them. So if we skim through A is saying something about historic architectural value, nothing about money, nothing about making money, doesn't look relevant. B is saying something about construction methods, contractors to decrease expenses. This doesn't tell us how the investors are going to make money. C tells us there's a new stock market about to be launched. Ooh, that sounds good. That's increased demand. Expected to attract many finance companies, higher rental rates. Ooh, making more money. That looks great. We're going to leave it. Look at the other two. D, new buildings built using advanced building techniques. This has nothing to do with making money. E, technological advancements are now enabling workers most of the tax from home. This does not tell us how the investors can make money. All right. So of the answer choices, only C is in the area of the likely answer that we expected, and therefore we can mark it and we can move on. And sort of the main take-home message, as far as I'm concerned, from this question is that this is how you should save time. This is how you should prevent getting confused by critical reasoning questions, and it's by writing a logical summary, using the summary to help you infer a likely answer, then looking for that answer. Now, should you actually write down the logical summary in the scratchpad on your exam? I don't know. That depends on your speed. I 100% recommend that you do it when you're practicing, because sort of this builds up the mental muscles. If you do it on the exam, or if you do it in your head on the exam, that's your choice. And the second key is that questions that have sort of this type of, let's call it quantitative reasoning behind them, in this case, it was supply and demand, profit and revenue, it's statistics, the things that I mentioned before, you should look for the logic. You should, so if the profit needs to go up, then either the revenue goes up or the cost goes down. So this type of logic is something that appears very, very frequently. It's something that you should look at. Cool. Let's look at the third key. And the third key in critical reasoning, which ties into all of your comments before and also what we've seen, is that you need to be very, very careful to answer the question that you are asked. All right. And in this case, we're going to put the entire question on the board. I think I'm also going to put the summary up straight away. We're going to go with an alternative approach for this question. And so let's just go through it. The logic of this question is relatively very simple. So with continuously growing populations, developing countries are purchasing many genetically modified crops, whose yield are substantially higher than those of regular plants. Okay, so we can write that down in a summary as there's, more populations, or rather more population or growing populations. Therefore, the developing countries are purchasing more GNC. Statement number 2 is that the GNC opponents claim that since the consequences of such fast use are not clear, countries' governments must avoid the use of GNC plants at this time. It's a very clear pro and con sort of type of passage. There's not too much convoluted in this. We can write the second sentence as there are unclear consequences, and therefore they should purchase less. And the focus, from my point of view in this specific question, is to focus in on what the question is actually asking you. So which of the following, if true, most weakens the claim of the GNC opponents? All right. So first of all, we're only talking about the GNC opponents. So the correct answer is going to have to talk about what we wrote down as number 2, sort of the second part of the passage, something about the logic of the opponents. And the second thing that we need to notice is that we need to weaken this logic, right? And so now we can go over the answer choices, and we can just ask ourselves, does this address the actual question that we're being asked about? All right. So what does A do? A talks about plants are durable in droughts and arid conditions, more common in developing countries. Referring back to our logical summary, this talks about statement number 1. It talks about populations, increasing purchasing, why it should be good to purchase GNC or not. It doesn't talk about the consequences at all. And therefore, it doesn't really talk about the claim of the GNC opponents. It talks about 1. It doesn't talk about 2. So we can eliminate it. Similarly, option choice B talks about population growth rate in developing countries is higher. Again, this refers to things, the sort of the developing countries' reasons for purchasing more GNC. It doesn't talk about the consequences. And therefore, B can also be eliminated. Next, we can look at C. And in C, we have something a little bit different. So finally, we have research regarding the long-term effects of consumption of GNC foods is still inconclusive. So finally, we're talking about the consequences, but we're not weakening. We're strengthening, right? Because what does C do? C is saying, yes, the consequences are unclear. We don't know what the long-term effects are. And therefore, this is actually, if anything, it is strengthening the reasoning of the opponents and not weakening it. Therefore, it is also eliminated. Looking at D, then D says that governments and authorities act in light of the precautionary principles. This has nothing to do with either our statement number 1 or statement number 2. It's completely irrelevant. We can eliminate it. Hopefully, looking at E, we'll see that E is correct, but we still need to check it because we've gone through process of elimination here. And so what does E say? That immediate consequences of hunger resulting from insufficient food supply are far more severe compared to potential future health hazards. Okay, so let's break this down. So we're saying that the immediate consequences from not having GNC is more severe than some kind of future consequence. And this directly contradicts the opponent's logic, because the opponents are saying, well, you should purchase less because there are unclear consequences. And what is E saying? E is saying, no. You might be right that there are unclear consequences in the future, but there are much, much more severe things to deal with now. And that is why E is correct. All right, and so I sort of want to summarize the take-home messages from this specific question. Number one is making sure that you're answering the right question. In this specific case, we used the question, which is to say the fact that we're looking at the claim of the opponents of the GNC, and that we need to weaken the claim to help us filter out some of the answer choices without thinking about them too much. Again, this isn't a terribly hard CR question, but it does sort of serve as an example of the point. And there are many CR questions where students get them wrong because they're just answering the wrong question. So this is something you need to be very careful about. Number two, and this is something that we don't have time to go into in this specific webinar, is that in critical reasoning, there really are incorrect answer types. And especially as most of you are sort of first timers to the GMAT world, then this is something that you should put a lot of effort into learning as you go along. So when you look at a critical reasoning question, you look at the right answer to it, make sure you also look at all of the other options and try to figure out why the wrong answer choices are wrong. Generally, I like to divide wrong answer choices into three categories. One is the opposite category, and this is, for example, in the previous question, the statement that strengthened instead of weakened. So it is a completely relevant answer that does the opposite of what you want it to do. Partial answer choices we didn't see today, but these are answer choices that are half right and half wrong, or half of them talk about what you want to talk about and the other half don't. This is also very common in reading comprehension, by the way. And the last type of answer choice is something that just is completely out of scope. It's either too narrow, it's too broad, it talks about something else, it's not related to the topic at hand. And therefore it is wrong. And again, we're not going to go too deeply into these different categories, but this is something that I strongly recommend that you look into as you pursue your studies. So to summarize, 4 most important keys to critical reasoning. One is break it down. Try to infer a likely answer before looking at the actual answer choices. Number 2 is look for all sorts of things that you already know about, such as profit, revenue, supply, demand, so on and so forth. Number 3 is be very, very careful to focus in on what the question is actually asking you. And number 4 is to know all of the trap answers, all of the different types of wrong answers out there. And when you have all of these 4 together cohesively, then you will be very, very good at CR questions. And then to the person who asked what the difference between 600 to 700 level questions are, you can start to look for yourself and see the different sort of types of tricks in the 700